One summer night in Dorchester during 2019, police cruisers rushed toward a block near Columbia Road after gunfire erupted outside an apartment building close to Cameron Street. Neighbors stepped onto porches quietly, already understanding the meaning behind flashing lights, since people living around Norton, Olney, Barry, plus Cameron had watched the same tension repeat for decades. Officers later confirmed that younger men connected to the NOB neighborhood had been involved in the shooting, while several suspects were barely 20 years old. That moment heavy was simple knowledge shared by longtime residents, since the young guys trading shots that night were not even born when the first blood between those streets spilled during the mid-1990s. Dorchester, located in Boston's southern section, became one of the largest Cape Verdean communities anywhere inside the United States during the late 20th century. Immigration increased steadily through the 1970s as families arrived from islands such as Santiago and Fogo seeking factory work, construction jobs, or stable educational opportunities for their children. By the mid-80s, many Cape Verdean households had settled around Bowdoin Street, Columbia Road, and Geneva Avenue, along with smaller side streets forming tight residential clusters. Churches such as St. Peter's Catholic Parish hosted gatherings where elders spoke Criollo, while youth switched comfortably between neighborhood slang plus English learned in Boston public schools. Families often knew one another through cousins, church membership, neighborhood barbershops, or youth leagues organized inside Dorchester recreation centers. That sense of closeness made daily life feel almost like a village within a major American city. Yet the same proximity also meant disputes rarely stayed private once arguments began growing among neighborhood teenagers. Columbia Road functioned as a busy corridor cutting through Dorchester, linking commercial storefronts, small markets, pizza shops, plus bus stops where high school students gathered after classes ended. Just a few blocks away sat Norton Street, Olney Street, plus Barry Street, three narrow residential roads filled with triple-decker homes that gradually shaped a shared street identity. Local teenagers started referring to that cluster simply through the initials NOB, which stood for Norton, Olney, Barry, even though at first it sounded more like neighborhood shorthand than a gang title. Only a short distance down the same Dorchester grid stood Cameron Street, another residential block carrying its own circle of families, childhood friendships, plus strong loyalty among young men growing up together. During the late 1980s, many teenagers from those streets actually attended the same schools, including Jeremiah E. Burke High School or nearby middle schools inside the Boston public system. Since they shared classrooms, basketball courts, corner stores, and bus stops, friendships often crossed street boundaries during early teenage years. However, as boys moved deeper into adolescence, identity slowly shifted toward whichever block someone called home every day. A young guy who spent afternoons hanging around Norton Street developed pride tied to that address, while another kid raised near Cameron Street carried similar loyalty rooted in family history. None of this started with an organized criminal structure during those early years, yet street reputation mattered deeply once teenagers began proving themselves among peers. Basketball courts near Dorchester parks often became the first arenas where arguments between groups developed. Trash talk during pickup games sometimes turned personal once someone referenced a particular block, especially if older cousins already had disagreements with people living nearby. School hallways occasionally witnessed scuffles when students representing different streets carried outside disputes into classrooms, though teachers frequently broke up fights before serious injuries occurred. Adults within the Cape Verdean community usually dismissed those clashes as normal teenage behavior, since most parents believed boys would eventually mature out of neighborhood pride. Unfortunately, those early confrontations planted seeds that later generations recognized as the beginning of something heavier. Meanwhile, the economic landscape surrounding Dorchester during the late 20th century created pressure on many families trying to maintain stability. Factory closures throughout Boston during the 1980s reduced employment opportunities for immigrant parents who originally arrived expecting steady industrial work. Some teenagers, therefore, grew up watching relatives juggle multiple jobs while money remained tight inside crowded apartments shared by extended family members. Small-scale drug dealing began appearing on certain Dorchester corners during the early 1990s, especially involving marijuana distribution or small crack cocaine transactions tied to wider Boston narcotics markets. Older street figures from different Boston neighborhoods occasionally passed through Dorchester, exposing younger residents to criminal economies that seemed profitable compared with low-wage employment. As those influences increased, A few teenagers living around Norton, Olney, Barry, plus Cameron, gradually adopted tougher reputations intended to discourage outsiders from disrespecting their blocks. Access to firearms also became easier during the early 1990s, partly connected to broader crime trends affecting many American cities during that era. What started earlier as playground arguments slowly evolved into deeper hostility once young men believed protecting neighborhood respect required physical retaliation. Even so, many community elders still expected tensions between the two street groups to fade eventually, since most earlier disputes ended through family mediation or school discipline. That expectation collapsed during the mid-1990s after one violent confrontation between young men from those neighborhoods ended with a fatal stabbing, which changed relationships across Dorchester almost overnight. By the mid-1990s, tensions between young men from the Norton, Olney, Barry cluster plus Cameron Street had already been simmering for several years, though most people still viewed those disputes as neighborhood pride mixed with teenage ego. What changed everything was a confrontation that happened during the mid-1990s when several young men connected to the two blocks ran into each other during a heated argument that quickly turned physical. Witnesses later recalled that the fight started like many others before it, involving shouting, pushing, plus a few punches thrown in the street while friends gathered around. However, the situation shifted in seconds once someone pulled a knife during the struggle, turning a street scuffle into a moment nobody inside Dorchester would forget. When the blade struck one of the young men connected to the opposing group, the injury proved fatal, transforming what had been neighborhood rivalry into a homicide that instantly changed how both sides saw each other. News of the killing spread fast across Dorchester once police confirmed that the stabbing victim had died from his wounds. Families connected to both neighborhoods heard the details through phone calls, word of mouth moving through barbershops, school hallways, plus crowded apartments where relatives gathered to understand what happened. Many parents believed that the tragedy would scare the young guys straight, since the death of a teenager inside a tight immigrant community carried enormous emotional weight. Older residents spoke openly about the risk of revenge while urging the families involved to calm things down before more bloodshed followed. At that moment, most people still expected grief to slow the situation, thinking the loss would force both sides to step back from street disputes that already felt out of control. Instead, the mood shifted quietly in the weeks that followed, especially among the younger men closest to the victim. Friends who had grown up alongside him on the same block felt pressure to respond, since street reputation inside those neighborhoods often demanded retaliation when someone from your circle was killed. Conversations among teenagers slowly turned from mourning toward anger, particularly when rumors circulated about who exactly held the knife during the deadly confrontation. Several young men connected to the victim began watching the streets more closely, asking around about movements of people linked to Cameron Street while planning how they might strike back. Within weeks, gunfire echoed through Dorchester, in what investigators later described as one of the first retaliatory shootings tied directly to the growing conflict between the two sides. That early retaliation did not produce immediate arrests, yet the message traveled clearly through the neighborhood once word reached both groups about who had been targeted. Young men from Cameron Street began viewing anyone tied to Norton, Olney, or Barry with suspicion, while guys from the NOB area carried the same attitude whenever they crossed paths with people connected to Cameron. What previously looked like isolated teenage arguments gradually hardened into something closer to a territorial feud, where loyalty to a block determined how someone interpreted everyday interactions. School arguments, street encounters, and even small insults started carrying a deeper meaning once each side believed the other had already crossed a line through deadly violence. As new teenagers grew older inside those neighborhoods, they inherited the tension without necessarily knowing every detail about the original stabbing that sparked it. By the late 1990s, the identities connected to each block became more clearly defined among local youth. Young men living near Norton Olney plus Barry embraced the initials NOB as shorthand representing their section of Dorchester, while Cameron Street developed its own reputation tied to defending its block. None of those identities began as formal criminal organizations, yet the rivalry between them gradually shaped social life for teenagers growing up nearby. A kid attending school with friends from both streets suddenly faced pressure to choose where his loyalty stood whenever arguments broke out. Once people started identifying themselves according to block allegiance, conflicts that once involved individuals now felt like clashes between entire neighborhoods. Boston Police Department officers eventually noticed that several violent incidents reported in Dorchester appeared connected through the same network of young men tied to those streets. Detectives reviewing reports from the late 1990s saw repeated names appearing in assault cases, disturbance calls, plus shootings involving individuals associated with either NOB or Cameron Street. Community leaders within Dorchester's Cape Verdean population attempted to intervene once they realized the rivalry had begun pulling younger teenagers into the conflict. Church figures, youth mentors, plus concerned parents organized meetings where elders encouraged both sides to settle their disputes peacefully before more lives were lost. Despite those efforts, the hostility kept resurfacing whenever another confrontation occurred between individuals from the opposing neighborhoods. What made the situation especially troubling for residents was the realization that the violence no longer revolved around a single argument from years earlier. Younger participants entering their late teens during the late 1990s treated the rivalry as inherited territory, even when they barely remembered the original stabbing that triggered the feud. Each new incident deepened the sense that Dorchester had developed two camps living only blocks apart, yet viewing each other through suspicion shaped by earlier bloodshed. Police reports documented scattered shootings, assaults, plus confrontations tied loosely to the same circle of young men connected to those neighborhoods. Instead of fading with time, the hostility gradually hardened into a repeating cycle where every violent act increased pressure for retaliation, setting the stage for a conflict that would stretch across the next 3 decades. During the late 1990s, the rivalry between the Norton, Olney, Barry area, plus Cameron Street slowly moved beyond random confrontations, since young men from both sides started organizing themselves around neighborhood loyalty. Guys living near Norton Street or Olney Street often gathered on familiar corners where friends spent afternoons talking, playing music, plus watching who passed through the block. Over time, those same young men began referring to themselves collectively using the initials NOB, a nickname that simply reflected Norton, Olney, and Barry, yet gradually carried a heavier meaning inside the streets. What started as casual neighborhood shorthand slowly turned into a label representing people willing to stand behind that part of Dorchester whenever trouble appeared. Cameron Street developed a similar internal unity once residents there realized the conflict with the nearby blocks had not faded after the earlier violence. As the years moved forward, loyalty toward each neighborhood became stronger among younger men growing up during the late 1990s. A teenager raised on Norton Street usually spent most of his time around friends from the same cluster of blocks, which naturally shaped his sense of identity once conflicts with Cameron Street resurfaced. At the same time, young men connected to Cameron Street treated their own block almost like family territory, especially when arguments with people from NOB appeared during school days or street gatherings. Street respect played a major role in shaping how these groups viewed each other, since nobody wanted the reputation of letting another neighborhood disrespect their area. Personal grudges blended with neighborhood pride until arguments between individuals gradually felt like clashes between two separate camps living only a few blocks apart. While those loyalties hardened, another influence entered the situation through the expanding street economy that existed in several parts of Dorchester during that era. Small-scale drug sales involving marijuana or crack cocaine already appeared in certain corners near Columbia Road, creating opportunities for young men seeking quick money. Some individuals tied to the NOB area began participating in those small operations, which gave them a little cash plus a certain level of influence among younger teenagers watching from nearby sidewalks. Cameron Street had its own young men experimenting with the same street hustle, since that kind of activity had become common across many Boston neighborhoods during the late 1990s. Money from those sales sometimes helped individuals purchase nicer clothes, vehicles, or jewelry, which quietly increased their status inside local social circles. Once cash entered the picture, the rivalry between the neighborhoods grew even more complicated, since financial interests mixed with old resentments from earlier confrontations. A young man who made decent money selling drugs on a particular corner suddenly cared more about protecting that location from outsiders. Meanwhile, another person from a rival block might view that same territory as a challenge to his neighborhood reputation. Those tensions sometimes surfaced during arguments at parties, school events, or street gatherings where people from both sides crossed paths. Instead of calming down after the initial stabbing years earlier, the conflict slowly expanded through a mixture of pride, personal anger, plus economic competition inside Dorchester's street environment. Violence during the late 1990s did not happen every week, Yet several incidents gradually convinced investigators that the rivalry had become a serious pattern. Boston Police Department officers responded to multiple assault calls involving young men connected to the same neighborhoods near Columbia Road. Some cases involved fistfights or beatings where victims refused to cooperate with detectives, which made it difficult for officers to prove exactly what had happened. Other situations escalated into shootings where bullets struck parked vehicles or apartment buildings, though witnesses often declined to identify the gunman. Police reports from that period began listing familiar names tied to Norton, Olney, Barry, plus Cameron Street, creating early records that detectives later revisited when examining the long feud. Each new incident added pressure within the community, since residents living around those blocks understood that arguments between the young men were not disappearing. Families who had once treated the rivalry as typical teenage behavior slowly recognized that the situation had crossed into something more dangerous. Parents began telling children to stay away from certain corners after dark, especially locations where groups of young men gathered late at night. Some residents avoided walking near particular streets during evening hours, choosing longer routes home simply to stay clear of potential trouble. Young kids growing up during that time quietly learned which blocks belonged to which group, absorbing that information the same way earlier generations had memorized neighborhood boundaries. For older community members, the situation felt painful, since many of them remembered when families from Norton Street, Olney Street, Barry Street, plus Cameron Street shared the same church events or youth gatherings. Watching the younger generation divide itself according to block loyalty made it clear that something had shifted permanently within the neighborhood. Community leaders still organized meetings, hoping to cool tensions, though younger participants often viewed those efforts as disconnected from realities happening on the street. Meanwhile, police officers continued documenting incidents connected to the rivalry, even though many cases stalled without witnesses willing to testify in court. By the time the late 1990s came to a close, Dorchester residents understood that the feud between NOB and Cameron Street had not disappeared, which quietly set the stage for an even more intense period once the early 2000s arrived. When the early 2000s arrived, the rivalry between the NOB area plus Cameron Street had already lived long enough to shape how younger teenagers viewed their own neighborhoods. Many boys who joined the tension during that period had been children when the original stabbing happened during the mid-1990s, which meant they learned about the feud mostly through stories told by older cousins or friends hanging around the block. A kid growing up near Norton Street often heard older guys mention conflicts with Cameron Street while standing outside corner stores or sitting on apartment stoops during summer evenings. Meanwhile, teenagers raised around Cameron Street absorbed the same street history through their own circles, hearing about past fights plus shootings tied to people from the NOB side. As those younger boys entered their mid-teenage years, they slowly stepped into roles that older participants once held, which allowed the rivalry to continue even after the original generation started aging out of the street. This new wave of teenagers treated the feud almost like inherited territory, rather than a dispute connected to one specific event. A young guy walking through Dorchester during those years quickly learned which blocks belonged to certain groups, since friends would quietly point out where trouble might start if someone crossed the wrong corner. Fights between teenagers linked to NOB or Cameron Street therefore felt routine once arguments broke out at house parties, school basketball games, or neighborhood gatherings near Columbia Road. Violence did not always involve guns, yet physical confrontations became common enough that many young men expected retaliation whenever someone from their block took a loss. That mindset slowly normalized the cycle of payback within certain groups, turning street disputes into a pattern where one incident almost guaranteed another confrontation later. As the 2000s continued, the rivalry sometimes stretched beyond the narrow streets where it first developed. Young men connected to either neighborhood traveled across other sections of Boston for parties, music events, or visits with friends living in nearby districts such as Roxbury or Mattapan. Whenever individuals from the opposing sides crossed paths outside Dorchester, those meetings occasionally sparked new arguments tied to the same block loyalties carried from home. Police reports from that period documented incidents where confrontations linked to the feud appeared in locations outside the original streets, which showed how the conflict followed participants wherever they moved around the city. Although the core tension still centered on Norton, Olney, Barry, plus Cameron Street, the influence of the rivalry began reaching other neighborhoods once younger members expanded their social circles. Despite the growing tension, many adults inside Dorchester continued trying to interrupt the cycle before more lives were lost. Local activists who had watched the situation unfold since the late 1990s worked alongside church leaders from the Cape Verdean community, hoping to create dialogue between families connected to both sides. Meetings sometimes took place inside community centers or church basements, where elders encouraged young men to step away from retaliatory violence that threatened the entire neighborhood. Pastors, youth counselors, plus longtime residents often reminded participants that many of their parents once knew each other through school, church gatherings, or family celebrations long before the feud began. Those conversations occasionally produced moments where young men listened quietly while older voices described how much the rivalry had already damaged Dorchester. For short periods, those peace efforts appeared to slow the tension between the groups. After certain meetings, residents noticed fewer confrontations for a while, which gave families hope that the younger generation might finally move beyond the hostility inherited from earlier years. Unfortunately, that calm rarely lasted once another argument erupted somewhere along the familiar streets near Columbia Road. When a fight or shooting occurred, pressure to respond returned quickly among individuals still committed to defending their block's reputation. Each renewed clash therefore erased progress made during earlier peace discussions, pushing the conflict back into the same cycle that had defined it since the mid-1990s. Residents living in those neighborhoods learned to recognize that pattern as the 2000s moved forward. Parents continued warning their children about which streets to avoid, especially once groups of teenagers gathered outside during late evening hours. Teachers working inside nearby Boston schools sometimes noticed students carrying the tension from their blocks into classrooms, even when administrators tried separating certain individuals after earlier fights. Community leaders remained active, though many admitted privately that stopping the feud required cooperation from young men who still valued street loyalty above everything else. While those struggles continued quietly inside Dorchester, another cultural shift was beginning to take shape during the late 2000s that would soon give the rivalry a new kind of visibility across Boston. During the next decade, music plus online platforms would place the voices of young men from those same streets in front of a much wider audience. Rappers from the NOB side, along with artists connected to Cameron Street, eventually began describing their neighborhood experiences through local drill-style tracks that spread across social media. Those songs introduced many listeners to the history behind Dorchester's street tensions, even though the feud itself had already existed for nearly 20 years. What once remained mostly local knowledge inside Boston gradually reached people far beyond the city once those voices started traveling through the internet. That shift would soon bring fresh attention to a conflict that had already shaped several generations, growing up along the same narrow streets. By the early 2000s, another force entered the story once younger voices from Dorchester started describing their neighborhoods through rap music shared across the internet. Teenagers who grew up hearing about the NOB and Cameron Street tension began recording songs that reflected everyday experiences from those blocks. Small studios around Boston offered cheap recording sessions, which allowed young artists to turn street stories into tracks posted on YouTube or SoundCloud. The music followed the growing drill style that had already spread from Chicago into other American cities during the early 2000s. That style favored heavy beats plus direct storytelling where rappers described their streets, friends, struggles, along with rivalries, without hiding much behind metaphors. For young men raised around Columbia Road, those recordings became another way to represent neighborhood pride. Artists from the NOB side started referencing Norton Street, Olney Street, plus Berry Street directly inside their lyrics, turning familiar Dorchester locations into recognizable names for listeners. Among the most widely discussed figures connected to that scene was a rapper known as G. Fredo, a young artist whose music openly referenced life around the NOB neighborhood. His videos often showed groups of friends standing on local blocks while rapping about loyalty, survival, plus tensions that had shaped those streets since the late 1990s. Viewers who already understood the background of the rivalry quickly recognized certain lyrics as subtle reminders of the long conflict with Cameron Street. What made those videos powerful for local youth was the feeling that someone from their own streets was finally telling stories that older generations had experienced quietly for years. Around the same time, the artists connected to the opposing side began producing their own tracks that carried similar energy from a different perspective. One of the names that surfaced during that period was 7981 Cal, a rapper whose music represented voices tied to Cameron Street and nearby circles. His songs followed the same drill-style structure, where lyrics reflected real street tension rather than fictional storytelling. Listeners from Dorchester could often identify references to specific locations, past confrontations, or block identities without the artist needing to spell everything out directly. Through those recordings, both sides gained a new way to broadcast their presence while reinforcing loyalty among younger listeners growing up around the same streets. Once those songs started spreading online, the rivalry between the neighborhoods gained a fresh dimension through social media interaction. Platforms like Facebook, Instagram, plus Twitter allowed young men from opposing sides to respond publicly whenever a lyric or video seemed to reference their block. Posts sometimes included insults directed toward rivals or comments questioning someone's reputation within the street environment. Those exchanges rarely stayed calm for long once friends from each side joined the conversation, turning online arguments into digital extensions of the same street conflict. A message written from a phone could therefore trigger real-world tension hours later if someone decided the comment crossed a line that required a response. Videos filmed on familiar Dorchester corners also made it easier for outsiders to see locations that had previously existed mostly inside local knowledge. A viewer from another city could watch a clip showing groups of young men standing near Norton Street or Cameron Street while performing lyrics that hinted toward the history between those blocks. Some listeners treated the songs purely as music, yet others began researching the background behind the rivalry mentioned in certain verses. Local news coverage occasionally mentioned the artists once police investigations connected some individuals to unrelated criminal cases. That attention pushed the story of the NOB and Cameron Street tension into conversations far beyond Dorchester. For residents living inside those neighborhoods, the internet exposure created mixed reactions. Some younger people felt proud watching familiar streets appear in popular music videos that gathered thousands of views online. Older community members often worried that the songs might encourage teenagers to treat the rivalry like entertainment rather than a conflict that had already cost lives. Teachers, youth counselors, plus parents occasionally warned young listeners about taking those lyrics too seriously. Despite those concerns, the drill scene continued growing throughout Boston during the mid-2000s, with artists from several neighborhoods contributing their own voices to the movement. Even while music videos brought attention to the ongoing rivalry between the NOB area and Cameron Street, the conflict itself never disappeared. Behind the videos, social media posts, and local reputation, tensions continued to shape everyday life in parts of Dorchester. For longtime residents, the internet did not create the feud. It simply gave an old conflict a new platform. Arguments that once stayed on neighborhood streets could now spread online within minutes, often reaching hundreds of people before returning to the real world. Throughout the 2010s, the rivalry repeatedly resurfaced through shootings and violent incidents that kept Dorchester in local headlines. Boston police responded to numerous reports of gunfire near Columbia Road and surrounding streets. Vehicles, sidewalks, and residential buildings were struck during incidents connected to individuals associated with the same neighborhood circles. Many of these events occurred during evening gatherings when groups of young men spent time outside apartment buildings or socialized in areas that had long been linked to neighborhood tensions. Local news outlets occasionally reported on these incidents after investigators confirmed connections to young men from blocks already known for long-standing disputes. Not every shooting resulted in a death, but the frequency of the violence reminded residents that the rivalry described in older police reports remained very much alive. Investigators noticed a pattern that appeared repeatedly over the years. Many shootings seemed connected to earlier confrontations. Arguments at parties, disagreements on social media, or encounters on the street often escalated into acts of retaliation. A dispute that appeared minor on the surface could quickly develop into something much more serious. Detectives reviewing case timelines frequently found that one violent event was often followed by another, creating a cycle that was difficult to break. For those directly involved, the consequences extended far beyond neighborhood reputation. Several young men connected to the feud lost their lives during shootings linked to disputes between the two sides. Friends and family members gathered at vigils and memorials, surrounding photographs with candles, while grieving relatives spoke about sons, brothers, cousins, and friends whose lives ended too soon. The tragedy affected more than those directly involved in the conflict. Families throughout Norton Street, Olney Street, Berry Street, and Cameron Street experienced the fear and grief that accompanied repeated violence. Parents worried whenever their children left home. Siblings found themselves caught between friendships and neighborhood loyalties. Some families that once shared close cultural and community ties gradually found themselves separated by divisions that had grown over decades. The emotional impact spread throughout the wider community. Residents grew accustomed to hearing sirens late at night and wondering what had happened. Some people changed their daily routines to avoid certain areas. Teachers noticed students carrying the stress of neighborhood tensions into classrooms, making it harder for them to focus on schoolwork and daily responsibilities. As the years passed, many residents began living with a constant sense of uncertainty. Even during periods of relative calm, people understood that another incident could quickly reignite tensions. What had started decades earlier had evolved into something much larger, a conflict that continued influencing daily life for an entire community. As violence continued appearing throughout the 2000s and 2010s, law enforcement agencies began treating the conflict as more than a series of isolated incidents. Investigators within the Boston Police Department recognized that many of the shootings, assaults, and disturbances seemed connected through the same individuals, neighborhoods, and patterns of retaliation. What appeared to outsiders as separate crimes often looked very different when viewed through years of police records. Specialized gang units started reviewing older reports involving Columbia Road and surrounding streets. Officers assigned to the Youth Violence Strike Force paid close attention to individuals whose names repeatedly appeared in investigations connected to Norton Street, Olney Street, Berry Street, and Cameron Street. Their goal was not only to solve individual crimes, but also to understand how the rivalry functioned as a whole. Detectives spent years building detailed records that mapped relationships between people involved in the conflict. They tracked associations, common gathering places, previous disputes, and incidents that had the potential to trigger future violence. Many investigators became deeply familiar with the neighborhoods because they had spent years responding to calls in the same areas. Gathering information, however, was often difficult. Many residents felt uncomfortable speaking openly with police about neighborhood tensions. Some feared retaliation, while others simply distrusted law enforcement. As a result, investigators relied heavily on surveillance and long-term observation. Officers monitored locations known for repeated disturbances and studied patterns of activity around individuals under investigation. As social media became increasingly important in everyday life, detectives also began examining online activity. Posts, photographs, comments, and videos sometimes revealed alliances, disputes, or warnings connected to the ongoing rivalry. While social media rarely told the entire story, it often helped investigators understand relationships that might otherwise remain hidden. Informants occasionally provided additional information. Some individuals facing criminal charges agreed to cooperate with authorities by sharing details about shootings, firearms, or planned retaliation. Detectives carefully evaluated these statements, knowing that credibility was essential when preparing cases for prosecution. When combined with surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and existing police reports, these sources sometimes help solve cases that had remained unsolved for years. As evidence accumulated, federal authorities became involved in several investigations. Agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives worked alongside Boston investigators when firearms offenses appeared connected to the rivalry. Federal prosecutors often focused on gun-related charges because they could carry significant prison sentences, even in cases where witnesses were unwilling to testify about specific acts of violence. Joint task forces brought together local and federal agencies in an effort to disrupt the networks behind the conflict. Investigators targeted individuals suspected of carrying illegal firearms, trafficking weapons, or participating in criminal activity connected to the feud. These efforts reflected strategies that had been used in other American cities facing similar long-running neighborhood conflicts. Several arrests eventually led to federal prosecutions. In court, prosecutors presented evidence showing that certain individuals connected to the rivalry had illegally possessed firearms despite previous criminal convictions that prohibited them from doing so. Some defendants accepted plea agreements, while others were convicted and received lengthy prison sentences. For many residents, those convictions offered hope that the violence might finally decrease. Police officials frequently emphasized the importance of removing repeat offenders from neighborhoods that had experienced years of shootings and retaliation. Yet even as arrests increased, investigators recognized a larger problem. Removing individuals from the streets did not automatically eliminate the deeper divisions that had developed over decades. Older participants might go to prison or leave the neighborhood, But younger people often grew up hearing the same stories, learning the same loyalties, and inheriting the same tensions. The challenge facing both law enforcement and community leaders was becoming increasingly clear. Enforcement could reduce immediate threats, but ending a conflict rooted in generations of neighborhood identity would require much more than arrests alone. While police investigations and federal prosecutions continued, many residents understood that enforcement alone could not solve the problem. Community members frequently voiced frustration when new incidents occurred despite years of arrests and increased police presence. Parents attending neighborhood meetings often asked the same question: if so many people had already been arrested, why did the violence continue? Officials increasingly pointed to a deeper issue. The conflict was no longer sustained only by the individuals directly involved. It had become part of the social environment surrounding several Dorchester blocks. New generations were growing up hearing stories about past shootings, old rivalries, and neighborhood loyalty long before they fully understood how the conflict had begun. By the late 2010s, many teenagers living near Norton Street, Olney Street, Berry Street, and Cameron Street had been born years after the original events that sparked the feud. Yet they still grew up surrounded by its legacy. Older friends, relatives, and neighbors shared stories about past confrontations, lost friends, and neighborhood history. Over time, those stories became a form of local folklore passed from one generation to the next. For many young people, loyalty to a particular block became closely tied to personal identity. They learned which streets were considered friendly territory and which areas carried tension. They heard stories explaining why certain rivalries existed and why neighborhood reputation mattered. What had originally been a specific dispute gradually transformed into something larger, an inherited sense of belonging connected to place and history. At the same time, technology was changing how conflicts developed. Previous generations had relied on face-to-face encounters, but smartphones and social media introduced entirely new ways for disputes to spread. Arguments that once might have remained limited to a small group could now reach hundreds of people within minutes. A single comment, photograph, or post could quickly circulate among people connected to either side of the rivalry. When someone felt disrespected online, the conflict often moved back into the real world. Investigators reviewing incidents during the late 2010s frequently found that social media arguments had preceded physical confrontations. In many cases, technology did not create new tensions, it simply accelerated existing ones. Community organizations worked hard to interrupt that cycle. Youth counselors organized mentoring programs that encouraged teenagers to think beyond neighborhood disputes. Churches hosted discussions about reconciliation and personal responsibility. Community leaders encouraged young people to focus on education, employment, sports, and creative opportunities rather than conflicts rooted in the past. For brief periods, those efforts appeared successful. Some teenagers built friendships across neighborhood lines, participated in community programs, and focused on goals unrelated to the rivalry. Yet the progress often remained fragile. Whenever another confrontation occurred, old divisions could quickly reappear. This repeating pattern demonstrated how deeply the conflict had become embedded within the community. Even individuals who wanted to move beyond the feud often found themselves surrounded by its history. The stories, expectations, and loyalties connected to earlier generations continued influencing how many young people viewed themselves and their surroundings. By the early 2020s, many residents recognized that the rivalry had become more than a series of violent incidents. It had evolved into a lasting part of Dorchester's history. While some young people actively rejected the divisions of the past, others remained influenced by traditions and loyalties they had inherited rather than chosen. The future increasingly depended on which influence would prove stronger. The weight of old conflicts or the efforts of a community determined to create a different path for the next generation. More than 3 decades after the first deadly clash connected to the NOB and Cameron Street rivalry, the area surrounding Columbia Road reflects both change and continuity. New businesses, renovated apartment buildings, and development projects have altered parts of the neighborhood. Yet many longtime residents still recognize the same streets that played a role in the conflict's history. Walking through Dorchester today reveals a community balancing progress with memory. On warm evenings, residents gather outside local stores, families spend time together, and children ride bicycles through streets that older generations have known for decades. At first glance, much of the neighborhood appears far removed from the violence that once dominated headlines. Yet beneath that sense of normalcy, memories of the rivalry remain deeply embedded within the community. Longtime residents rarely forget the events that shaped previous decades. Many can still point to specific intersections and recall nights when police vehicles filled the streets after shootings or disturbances. Parents who raised children during the height of the conflict remember warning them about certain routes home from school or advising them to avoid situations that could place them at risk. Although the intensity of the rivalry has changed over time, awareness of its history remains part of local conversation. The conflict left behind more than police reports and criminal cases. It left memories carried by families, neighbors, teachers, and community leaders who witnessed its impact firsthand. Law enforcement agencies continue monitoring activity connected to individuals associated with the long-running feud. Officers remain aware of patterns that previously contributed to violence, while detectives continue reviewing incidents involving firearms, assaults, and disturbances. At the same time, police increasingly work alongside community organizations in an effort to prevent problems before they escalate. Community leaders have expanded their efforts as well. Churches, mentoring programs, neighborhood organizations, and local activists continue encouraging young people to pursue opportunities that lead away from violence. Many programs focus on education, employment, sports, and creative activities that help teenagers build identities beyond neighborhood rivalries. Former participants in the conflict occasionally speak at community events, sharing personal experiences about the consequences of violence. Some discuss friends they lost, years spent in prison, or opportunities they missed because of decisions made during their youth. Their stories serve as powerful reminders of the costs associated with continuing the cycle. Schools have also become important partners in prevention efforts. Teachers, counselors, and coaches work to create environments where students from different parts of Dorchester can interact and cooperate. Sports teams, cultural programs, and community projects provide opportunities for young people to form connections that extend beyond neighborhood boundaries. Despite these efforts, uncertainty remains. Some teenagers growing up today show little interest in continuing disputes that began before they were born. Others still feel influenced by stories emphasizing neighborhood loyalty and reputation. This divide reflects the broader struggle between preserving community identity and moving beyond the conflicts of the past. For many residents, Dorchester stands at a crossroads. The neighborhood is known not only for its history of rivalry, but also for its resilience, cultural pride, and determination to create a better future. Festivals celebrating Cape Verdean heritage, youth sports tournaments, and community gatherings demonstrate a side of the neighborhood that is often overlooked when discussing its history. Looking back across 3 decades reveals how a single violent event can evolve into a conflict lasting generations. The story of NOB and Cameron Street is ultimately about more than violence. It is a story about identity, loyalty, loss, community, and the lasting effects of unresolved disputes. Today, the future rests with the next generation. Whether the rivalry continues or gradually fades into history will depend on the choices made by the young people growing up on those same streets. Choices that will determine how the next chapter of Dorchester's story is written.